Scope, issue, and risk management. In this video, you will learn how to successfully manage project scope, scope changes, as well as how to successfully identify and manage issues and risks on your project. The video is divided into the following topics: scope management, risk management, and issue management. So let's look at scope management first. So important when talking about scope management is a very clear definition of what is in scope, what is not in scope, and how to handle scope changes in terms of the definition of a scope change, a process for the scope change itself, and the direction for how to handle the scope change. You don't want to end up in a situation like our good friend Dilbert here, where scope changes or change requests are piling up. That said, changes in scope is not necessarily a bad thing. You just need to make sure there is a process in place for how to deal with it. Most important is that the scope needs to be documented at all times. So in the beginning of your project, you have the project charter and your contract if it's an external vendor. That is the documentation of what am I going to build, and this is linked to the business case, the problem that the project has to resolve. So if any changes to that baseline, or even before we talk about changes, we need to make sure that the baseline is very clear. The project charter scope must be crystal clear. What is in scope, what is not in scope. As we then start the project, we might come to the conclusion that we need to adjust the scope, and for that we need to have the scope management process. So as we discussed before in previous lessons, we saw that scope, the cost of changes, normally go up on a project. Now that is true, and if you look here at the cost of scope changes, you can see that during the requirement gathering, the scope change cost is very small. During the design, it's higher, and so on. Now, one point I want to make here, that not all changes necessarily have a cost or schedule impact, but the cost might be indirect. It might be a cost in terms of you need to allocate people to assess the change, to update the documentation, and once that's done, the change itself doesn't take more time than the initial scope. So it might be that you are just changing a few small parameters, or you're changing something that it doesn't matter if you do it A or B. But in order to document it, and the whole process of getting the scope change documented, assess the impact, and approve, it in itself is an indirect cost that increases. There's an arrow that goes down, but the cost, you can see, is highest in the bottom. So the cost goes up, the effort goes up, and therefore the indirect cost goes up of each changes if you are doing it in the maintenance phase or you're doing it in the requirement phase. Now, in these charts, what they mean about scope change is that you need to change the requirements completely. Normally that's what definition is here. So yes, if you haven't started building anything, of course it is cheaper than if you already documented what you're going to build and found a solution. And if you already built it, then it is more expensive than if you haven't. And once you build it, then it becomes more expensive to reverse it, and so on. But I want to stress again that not all changes has a cost or schedule impact necessarily. And that's why you need to get to a point on your project where it is acceptable and it is common practice. There is a culture amongst your project members to actually raise change requests or scope change requests if they see something that is deviating from the initial scope. It might be small, it might be wordings, it might be big where you really need to change the solution. Either way, it all needs to be raised up through the scope management process, documented, so for future reference, if someone asks what was the scope that this project achieved or was implemented, then you can go back, you can take the project charter plus any scope change request you have, and at the end of the day you have the full picture. So the scope management process must be in place, must be enforced, no matter if there is an impact or not. And to find out if there's an impact or not when you have a scope change, first of all, if someone says we have a scope change, you need to define what exactly is the change we're going to do. What is the scope change? What is the definition? Secondly, you verify that this is truly change, and then you implement and control it. And this also goes for the initial scope. You define your scope, you verify that this is what I'm going to build, and then you control that I'm not building anything else. If there's a change, you need to get the change approved. What is the impact to your scope definition? And then you go through the link again through this process to update your scope. With that said, we should now have a process in place where we have no changes to what we are supposed to do to the scope of the project without we go through the process. And therefore everyone is sitting working on the exact same scope, the scope that is documented in the project charter and the scope documents, and nothing else. If there's no scope change approved, there is no change to those documents. Then let's look at the risk management. So what is a risk? And I found this small cartoon here that a risk is not necessarily that you cover yourself in pillows to avoid getting hit by something unpleasant. The risk management is a process where you create awareness of what could potentially go wrong. Now, the process starts here, where you go through a circle where you start to identify the risks, you analyze how am I going to, what is the impact of those risks I identified, you then plan how am I going to deal with the risk, you track that you execute your plan, how you're going, your action plan, your mitigation plan, and then you control, has you improved the situation, or is the risk still there? Along the way, please make sure to communicate so everybody is aware that on your project you have a risk right now. It might be related to people, external dependencies, technology, but you have a risk, and if that risk happens, you will be in trouble or you will have an impact to your project. Then as you go through here, communicate what are you doing to address it. Is the risk still there? Has it changed? And what is the new situation? So a few things I want to share here, and the first one is that the risk identification. This is an exercise where you really should involve your entire team. And I have had good experience doing an interactive risk exercise where you get everyone engaged in with post-it notes and paper, and you get everyone engaged in identifying the risks in a room, and you then at the end of the day group those risks and you assign a person who now owns it as of now. That person can then go into analyzing more, and the risk might change owner during the analysis, but at least you need to have a clear ownership so the risk is addressed. And once you have identified the risk and you have analyzed it, that means you have the output of this is that you have a risk probability and impact assigned to each risk. And here I have shown you a chart or a matrix which is commonly used. I've used it on all of the projects I've been engaged in and heard of, this is used. So probability, you put in a value and you put a value on the impact axis. You will multiply the two together and then you plot in your risk. So you might have risk number 1 here, you might have risk number 2 up here, and so on. Risk number 4 you can't see, but then it's a low one. So this is the risk picture. Then you, in your risk plan, you say, what am I going to do with the green ones, the low risk? What am I going to do with the medium? What am I going to do with the high one? Each have different action taken. Normally you will only focus on risks that is in these quadrants. That is one you minimum need a mitigation plan or an action plan in place. Now then you can use this chart to track the risk. So risk number 4 might be low. The week after it might have moved, that now it is, the impact is higher as you enter a new phase, or it might be that risk number 3 that was high impact, medium probability, now has moved down to be in this quadrant. So you can track your risk movements and you can always focus on what are the risks up here, and you can see which one was up there in the previous period and which one is up there now. I've seen that reporting very successful. I've done the reporting myself. There's many ways of doing it, more or less detailed. But what that is important is that you take, you create a risk response, and to which risks, in which quadrants here you do. I normally do it minimum in these. Normally I also include this, so red and yellow. But the risk response that you then put in, you have certain options. So negative risk responses, meaning that if this risk is going to happen, and just for those that sit perhaps a little confused, what is a risk? It's something that if it happens, it hasn't happened yet, but if it happens, if this event occur on your project, meaning the risk happens, then it will either have a negative or a positive impact. Okay? So for those risks where the impact or the is actually should say impact here, where the impact, if it happens, is negative. For those that is high probability or high impact, you should look at what response am I going to do. So the risk responses for negative risks are, can you do anything to avoid the risk to happen at all? Can you transfer the risk to something else? Can you buy an insurance against the risk? And thereby you are safe from at least financial impact. Or can you mitigate the risk by doing something so that if the risk happens, you will initiate this mitigation action, and that will then avoid or deflect some of the negative impact to your project. Now opposite for the positive risks. So if this risk happens, it will have a positive impact on your project. The responses are of course completely opposite. You should see if you can make this event, this risk event, happen. So exploit, can I make it happen because it's a positive impact on your project? Can I share it with someone? Meaning, is it possible again to trigger it to happen? Can I share this positive thing across my project to make it more likelihood that it happens? Or can I enhance it? Meaning, can I make it happen in a higher degree? Now I know this can be a little difficult to understand, but normally you will focus on the negative risk, because this is where you really need to have actions in place if it happens. Now what could a positive risk be? A positive risk could be that you have a situation where suddenly something becomes available to your project. A new technology release, or a new technology or person you didn't have before. And if you can make that person come, or if you can make use of that technology, you will have a positive impact on your project, because you can then do certain activities faster, or you can do certain things that you were not supposed to do before. So you need to exploit, can I have that person available quickly? for instance. So I think the picture here on the left, or sorry, on the right, says everything. So there's only 40% chance of rain, and that's for this person have then said I only need 40% of an umbrella. Again, this comes back to what are the specific risks and what are the actions that you need to take. Now, I'll be happy to go through your risk responses, guide you in much more detail of this. We have also a risk log, a tool that you can download from the website that can help you in your risk management. And if you want to hear more about the risk exercise, let me know. I'll be happy to share the exercises that I've practiced on engagements to get the team engaged and get them involved in identifying the risks. That leaves one item left in the agenda, and that's issue management. So let's just first recap what is a risk. A risk is an event that will have either negative or positive impact to the project if it's occurred. Now, an issue is an event that has occurred and that needs to be resolved for the project to be successful. It can be a high priority issue with high impact, or it can be a low issue that doesn't have impact now, but it have happened, otherwise it's not an issue, but it doesn't have significant impact at this moment. Now, a rule of thumb here is that I would say that any high priority issues is issues that's impacting the critical path. So let's look about some of the characteristics of an issue and how you deal with it. So an issue, something that has happened. You need to have a number of parameters or characteristics in place to deal with issues. You need to know, give it an ID for tracking it. When did the issue happen? What is the description? What is this issue all about? What work stream does it impact? What is the urgency of this? Is this something that if it's not solved by tomorrow, it will impact your project, or is it something that is not that urgent? What is the priority, meaning what is the impact of the issue when it happens? That should be the priority of which issues to happen first. The status, this issue has just been raised, no action have taken. So let's find out what is the resolution to this issue. Or you can say, what is the next step that needs to happen? Who is responsible for doing the next step or from executing the resolution? When is the resolution planned? When is the resolution due? And in order to achieve the resolution, you need to execute the next step. So when is the next step's due date? You have who is doing it, when is it done or to be done. This is a lot of different parameters that you need to record if you have an issue raised. And let's just go back here 3 slides and see the issue is an event that has occurred, and therefore all of these items needs to be addressed. We have in the website an issue log that you can download and start using, recording your issues on your project. Now, one thing before we do the summary, I've never seen any projects that do not have an issue. If you have no issues, there's something wrong. Either you are not using your issue management process, or something is not coming up in the open. There needs to be issues recorded. Every project has issues. Some have more than others, and hopefully a healthy project, you have issues raised, swiftly resolved, and you move on without any impact. With that said, let's do a summary. So after completing this video, you should now have good understanding on how to successfully manage your project scope changes, as well as to identify and manage issues and risks. And as mentioned, we have risk and issue additional material available for download.